The steel-gray sky over Palermo hung heavy with rain on the morning of August 23, 1943. Inside a requisitioned Italian villa that now served as a Wehrmacht signals intelligence station, Hauptmann Ernst Müller bent over a battered American radio set that his men had recovered from the rubble of a captured position 3 days earlier. The device still bore the scorch marks from the firefight that had killed its operator, a young American corporal from the 45th Infantry Division whose identification papers lay in a separate folder on Muller's desk. The radio was unlike anything Muller had seen in 2 years of examining captured enemy equipment. It was compact, a single backpack unit weighing perhaps 35 pounds, yet when his technicians had powered it up using a salvaged American battery, it had produced a signal so clear, so utterly free of the crackling static that plagued every German field radio he'd ever used, that for a moment he thought the equipment was malfunctioning. The Americans called it the SCR-300. Muller's report would eventually reach the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht in Berlin, but even then, even with the technical specifications laid bare and the implications understood, the German army would find itself unable to replicate what this simple radio represented, a fundamental reimagining of how modern infantry fought. What Muller did not yet realize as he rotated the radio's tuning dial and watched it click through 41 separate channels, was that he was holding physical evidence of why German coordination was becoming impossible. The answer wasn't in the radio's frequency modulation technology, though that was revolutionary. It wasn't in its weather-resistant design or its surprising range of 3 to 5 miles. The answer was in who carried it. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The Sicily campaign had been a brutal education for the Wehrmacht. Since the Allied landings on July 10, 1943, German forces had fought a skilled delaying action across the island's rugged terrain, but even in retreat, German commanders had noticed something fundamentally different about how American units maneuvered. American infantry companies seemed to possess an almost uncanny ability to coordinate their movements, to call in artillery support with devastating speed, to adapt to changing battlefield conditions in real time. At first, senior German officers attributed this to superior numbers or better equipment. Some whispered that the Americans must have broken German codes. The truth was simpler and far more troubling. Every American rifle company had at least one SCR-300 radio. Every American rifle platoon had at least one SCR-536 handheld radio. The Americans weren't reading German minds. They were simply talking to each other. To understand why this mattered, one must first understand what the German army believed about battlefield communications in 1943. The Wehrmacht had entered the Second World War as perhaps the most sophisticated military force in history, with a command philosophy called Auftragstaktik, mission-type tactics, that had been refined over decades of Prussian military tradition. Under this system, a commander gave his subordinates a clear mission objective and the resources to accomplish it, but left the specific methods to their judgment. Junior officers and even non-commissioned officers were expected to show initiative, to adapt to changing circumstances, to act independently when communications broke down. It was a doctrine built for the chaos of modern warfare, where telephone wires would be cut by artillery fire and radio signals would be jammed by enemy interference. German officers trained to function 2 levels above their actual rank. A platoon leader could command a battalion if necessary. A company commander could direct regimental actions. The system had produced the stunning victories of 1939 and 1940, Poland crushed in weeks, France defeated in 6 weeks, the Soviet Union driven back hundreds of miles. But Auftragstaktik had a fundamental weakness that would only become apparent when the Wehrmacht faced an enemy who could communicate faster than German forces could execute their decentralized maneuvers. The system assumed that once orders were given and units dispersed, commanders would operate semi-independently until the next scheduled situation report or until they physically returned to headquarters. In the Polish and French campaigns, this had worked brilliantly because German forces had been on the offensive, driving forward faster than their enemies could react, and because the actual coordination happened at battalion and regimental level where German radios were concentrated. The German infantry radios available in 1943 reflected this philosophy. The primary tactical radio was the Tornister Funkgerät D2, universally known as the Torn.Fu.D2, a VHF transceiver that operated in the 33.8 to 38 MHz range. It was a capable piece of equipment by the standards of the early war years. It could transmit Morse code up to 10 kilometers and voice communications up to 3 kilometers. It used vacuum tube technology and could be operated on the move. But here was the crucial limitation that Muller and his fellow signals officers had always accepted as simply the nature of portable military radio. The Torn.Fu.D2 required 2 men to function. One soldier carried the transmitter and receiver unit on his back, weighing approximately 8 kilograms. A second soldier, connected to the first by a cable, carried the battery pack and power supply, adding another 9 kilograms to the load. The 2 men were effectively tethered together, reducing tactical mobility. More importantly, the system required dedicated communications personnel at the company level. Men who were not carrying rifles, not manning machine guns, not available for assault duties. Because of these limitations, German infantry radios were typically issued only at the battalion level. A battalion headquarters might have 4 Torn.Fu.D2 sets to communicate with its companies. Company commanders communicated with their platoons primarily through runners and hand signals, just as soldiers had done in the trenches of the previous war. When situations evolved rapidly, when units became separated by terrain or combat, when opportunities for exploitation appeared suddenly, company and platoon leaders had no reliable way to coordinate without physically meeting or sending messengers who might take minutes or hours to complete their journey. This had been acceptable, even superior, when fighting enemies with similar limitations. But the Americans were playing a different game entirely. Muller carefully opened the SCR-300's waterproof case and studied its internal construction. 18 vacuum tubes, his technicians had counted. A sophisticated frequency modulation transmitter that Daniel Noble and Henryk Magnuski had designed back in 1942 at the Galvin Manufacturing Corporation in Chicago. The frequency modulation technology was itself a minor miracle, where amplitude modulation radios transmitted information by varying the strength of the radio wave. Frequency modulation varied the frequency itself, making the signal almost immune to the atmospheric interference and electrical noise that plagued battlefield communications. The American War Department had given Motorola, Galvin's trade name, a specific challenge in 1940: create a portable, battery-powered voice radio for infantry units that weighed no more than 35 pounds, could be carried on one soldier's back, would communicate reliably over 3 miles, and could be operated by troops with minimal training. The Signal Corps had specified 41 channels of communication in the 40 to 48 MHz band, enough frequency diversity that multiple units could operate in the same area without interfering with each other. What made Muller's stomach tighten as he examined the radio was not its technical sophistication, though that was impressive enough. What disturbed him was the implication of its existence. The Americans had industrialized the production of these radios. Motorola would eventually produce nearly 50,000 SCR-300 units during the war. 50,000 radios capable of providing clear, reliable voice communication over distances of 3 to 5 miles. 50,000 radios light enough to be carried by a single soldier, operated by that same soldier, requiring no special training beyond a brief introduction to the controls. The operational implications were staggering. An American rifle company with one SCR-300 could maintain constant contact with battalion headquarters up to 5 miles away. When that company's forward observers spotted enemy positions, they could call in artillery corrections in real time, adjusting fire as shells fell, bringing devastating accurate firepower to bear within minutes. When company commanders needed to coordinate with adjacent units, they simply changed channels on their radios. When tactical situations changed, when an enemy counterattack materialized or when an exploitable gap in defenses appeared, American commanders at every level could share that information instantaneously. More than this, the Americans issued handheld SCR-536 radios, the handy-talkie as soldiers called it, down to the platoon level. These smaller radios had a range of only about 1 mile, used amplitude modulation, and operated on a single crystal-controlled frequency, but they meant that even a platoon leader separated from his company by terrain or combat could still communicate. Every American rifle company by late 1943 had 6 SCR-536 radios, 1 for each of the 3 rifle platoon leaders, 2 for the weapons platoon, and 1 for the company commander. The contrast with German communications doctrine couldn't have been starker. Where German companies relied on runners and prearranged signals, American platoons had radios. Where German battalions might have 4 radio sets shared among all their companies, American battalions had dozens. Where German doctrine emphasized independence because communications would inevitably fail, American doctrine was beginning to emphasize coordination because communications usually worked. Muller set down the SCR-300 and walked to the villa's window, looking out over the smoke-stained rooftops of Palermo. His mind was already composing the report he would have to write, knowing that it would likely change nothing. The German signals industry could not match American production capacity. Even if they could replicate the SCR-300's design, which would require access to technologies and manufacturing techniques Germany simply didn't possess in sufficient quantity, they could not produce them in the numbers that would matter. The radio on his desk represented something more profound than technological superiority. It represented a fundamental difference in how the two armies conceived of battlefield command and control. The German army had developed Auftragstaktik because Prussia had always expected to fight larger, better-equipped enemies. The doctrine emphasized the quality of individual commanders, their initiative, and their ability to make decisions independently. It was a doctrine of necessity, born from resource constraints and strategic weakness. The Americans, by contrast, came from a tradition of industrial abundance and technological optimism. When faced with the problem of battlefield coordination, they had not trained their officers to be more independent. Instead, they had given every junior leader the tools to stay connected. They had manufactured their way out of the problem. What Müller understood, sitting in that villa in Palermo as the summer of 1943 turned toward autumn, was that the Wehrmacht faced an opponent who could execute both centralized coordination and decentralized initiative simultaneously. An American company commander could operate independently when necessary, exactly as Auftragstaktik prescribed. But unlike his German counterpart, that American commander never truly lost contact with his battalion. He could call for support. He could share information. He could coordinate with adjacent units. He could adapt not just to what he observed directly, but to what his entire battalion observed collectively. The mathematics of this advantage were brutal. A German battalion commander might learn about an enemy position through a runner who took 20 minutes to reach him from a forward company. By the time the commander formulated a response and sent orders back, another 20 minutes had elapsed. 40 minutes of elapsed time, during which the tactical situation had almost certainly changed, during which the enemy had moved, during which opportunities had appeared and vanished. An American battalion commander learned about that same enemy position within seconds through an SCR-300 radio call. His response, whether to call in artillery to redirect a flanking company, or to request tank support from the regiment, could be transmitted back just as quickly. The American decision cycle operated at a tempo the Germans simply could not match without similar communications technology. This was not merely theoretical. During the Sicily campaign, German after-action reports had repeatedly noted instances where American units seemed to respond to German movements with impossible speed. A German company would probe an American position, seeking weak points, only to find that American artillery had already adjusted to target their avenue of approach. A German battalion would attempt an envelopment, only to discover that American reserves had been shifted to block them before the maneuver was complete. German commanders had initially attributed this to superior American reconnaissance or to information leaks from Italian civilians. The reality was simpler. American forward observers were calling in what they saw, American platoon leaders were reporting enemy movements as they happened, and American commanders at every level were acting on information that was minutes fresh rather than hours old. The Americans weren't reading German minds. They were simply communicating faster than German forces could maneuver. Müller returned to his desk and picked up the SCR-300's handset. It was designed like a telephone receiver with a simple butterfly switch that rotated to transmit and released to receive. An American 19-year-old farm boy from Iowa could learn to operate this radio in an afternoon. The procedure was straightforward. Extend the 3-foot antenna, power on the unit and wait 10 minutes for the vacuum tubes to warm up. Select a channel with the tuning dial, adjust the squelch knob to eliminate background noise, and push the butterfly switch to talk. The elegant simplicity of the design mocked the complexity of German military communications. German radio operators required extensive training in Morse code for long-distance communication. They needed to understand electrical theory to properly maintain and repair their equipment. They worked in pairs, reducing combat effectiveness. And crucially, there were never enough of them. A German infantry division might have several dozen trained radio operators. An American infantry division had hundreds of soldiers who could operate an SCR-300 with minimal instruction. The industrial scale of American radio production revealed another uncomfortable truth. By late 1943, the American military-industrial complex had achieved production rates that seemed almost fantastical to German officers who understood their own nation's manufacturing constraints. The United States was producing radio frequency control crystals, essential components for stable radio transmission, at a rate of 1 million per month by the second half of the war. This single category of component production exceeded Germany's entire output of complete tactical radios. The Signal Corps had designated crystal production as the second highest manufacturing priority in the entire American war effort, surpassed only by the Manhattan Project. This decision reflected a fundamental American belief that communications technology would prove as decisive as raw firepower. The Germans had made different calculations, prioritizing tank and aircraft production, synthetic fuel development, and advanced weapons systems. Both sides were betting on their vision of how the war would be won. By 1943, it was becoming clear which bet would pay off. Muller had seen the effects of this disparity firsthand during the fighting around Jela in July. He had been attached to the 15th Panzergrenadier Division as a signals liaison officer when American forces from the 45th Infantry Division had come ashore. The initial German counterattack had been fierce, pushing to within a few hundred meters of the beaches. For a brief moment, it seemed the invasion might be thrown back into the sea. Then the American artillery had spoken. Not the sporadic, poorly coordinated fire that characterized Italian artillery, nor even the methodical but slow-responding fire of German batteries. This was something different entirely. American forward observers, positioned with the frontline infantry companies and equipped with SCR-300 radios, were calling in fire missions with a speed and accuracy that transformed artillery from a supporting arm into a devastating scalpel. Muller had watched through binoculars as German tanks approaching the beachhead were bracketed by the first spotting rounds, then buried under a concentration of fire that arrived within 90 seconds of the initial adjustment. The forward observers were talking directly to the fire direction centers, which were computing firing solutions and transmitting them to gun crews who could respond in under 2 minutes. The entire kill chain, from target identification to rounds on target, took less time than it would have taken a German runner to reach his company commander. The 15th Panzergrenadier Division had broken off the attack not because they were defeated in direct combat, but because they were being destroyed by an enemy they couldn't see, coordinated by communications they couldn't intercept or jam, operating at a tempo they couldn't match. German doctrine had no answer for this. Auftragstaktik assumed that independent commanders would make sound decisions based on what they could observe. But what good was independence when the enemy could mass fire faster than you could maneuver? The autumn rains that year turned the Italian peninsula into a morass of mud and misery. The Wehrmacht's fighting retreat up the Italian boot became a masterclass in defensive warfare, with German forces making the Allies pay for every kilometer of ground. But even in defense, even in terrain that heavily favored the defender, the communications gap continued to manifest in small but cumulative ways. German company commanders learned to dread the distinctive sound of American spotter planes, the slow-flying Piper Cubs that Americans called "grasshoppers," because they knew what would follow. The spotter plane would circle over German positions, its observer using an SCR-542 radio to relay coordinates directly to American artillery battalions. Within minutes, shells would begin falling with uncanny accuracy. The Germans called it the fire that followed the eyes in the sky. What German commanders often didn't realize was that the coordination went deeper than they imagined. Those Piper Cubs were talking to the artillery, yes, but the artillery was also in constant radio contact with the infantry companies they were supporting, and those infantry companies were talking to their battalion commanders, who were talking to their regimental commanders, who were talking to the air liaison officers who could call in fighter-bomber strikes. The entire system functioned as an integrated network, with information flowing in every direction, with decisions being made and executed at speeds that would have seemed impossible just a few years earlier. By contrast, a German company commander who spotted an opportunity to counterattack might send a runner to battalion headquarters requesting permission and support. If the runner made it through artillery fire and didn't get lost in the confusion of battle, if the battalion commander was available and made a quick decision, if the orders were transmitted back successfully, and if the supporting units could be coordinated through their own separate chains of command, the counterattack might be launched within an hour. Often by then the opportunity had vanished. The American Rifle Company with its SCR-300 radios, its interconnected platoons, its direct line to battalion and often to regiment, was becoming something that no previous military force in history had achieved. A small unit that fought with the coordinated strength of a much larger formation. A single American company could mask the combat power of an entire battalion because it could call in that battalion's support instantaneously. Muller drafted his report over 3 evenings in September 1943, working by lamplight in the villa while the sounds of distant artillery rumbled through the Mediterranean night. He tried to be precise, to avoid hyperbole, to present facts that his superiors could act upon. He documented the SCR-300 specifications: frequency range, power output, weight, channel capacity. He described how the radio worked, how it was deployed, how it was integrated into American tactical doctrine. But the heart of his report was a single paragraph that he rewrote 7 times before settling on language that conveyed the enormity of what he had realized. The American SCR-300 radio represents not merely a technical advance in communications equipment, but a fundamental reimagining of how infantry forces can be controlled and coordinated in combat. By providing reliable voice communications at the company and platoon level, the Americans have created a command structure that combines the initiative of decentralized operations with the coordination of centralized control. A German battalion commander with 4 radios must choose which companies to remain in contact with. An American battalion commander with dozens of radios maintains contact with all his units simultaneously. This disparity cannot be overcome through superior training or tactical skill. It is a structural advantage that compounds with every engagement. The report went up the chain of command through the normal channels. Müller never learned if anyone at the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht read it, or if they did, whether they understood its implications. By that autumn of 1943, the German High Command was drowning in reports about American and Soviet material superiority. One more document describing another area where the enemy had better equipment probably seemed like just more noise. But across the front lines, in staff meetings and command posts, in field exercises and war games, American officers were already thinking about how to exploit their communications advantage even further. The SCR-300 was just the beginning. Engineers were working on lighter batteries, more reliable tubes, more weatherproof cases. Doctrine writers were developing new tactics that assumed constant communication between all elements of a combat team. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The Wehrmacht, meanwhile, continued to rely on doctrine that had been perfected in the 1920s and 1930s. Auftragstaktik remained the foundation of German tactical thinking because there was no alternative. Germany could not produce SCR-300s. Even if they had captured the complete design specifications, even if they had understood every circuit and component, they lacked the industrial capacity to manufacture them in meaningful numbers. The United States was outproducing Germany in every category of military equipment, but nowhere was the disparity more pronounced than in electronics and communications. The numbers were stark. By 1944, American factories were producing tactical radios at a rate that exceeded German production by a factor of 10 to 1. The United States had nearly 50,000 SCR-300 radios in the field. Germany had perhaps 5,000 Torn.Fu.D2 radios across their entire military. When one factors in the SCR-536 handhelds, the SCR-508 tank radios, and the myriad other American communications equipment, the gap widened to perhaps 20 to 1. This wasn't simply a matter of raw production capacity, though that was certainly a factor. It reflected a deeper difference in how the two nations approached the problem of modern warfare. The Germans had built an army around the concept of Auftragstaktik because they expected to fight outnumbered, because they needed to maximize the initiative and skill of their officers, because they came from a tradition of resource scarcity. The Americans had built an army around the concept of overwhelming material support for the individual soldier. When faced with the problem of coordination, they didn't train their way out of it, they manufactured their way out of it. An American private carried a radio instead of developing the skills to operate independently without one. An American platoon leader called for artillery support instead of learning to fight without it. This wasn't laziness or lack of skill, it was a recognition that reliable communications and abundant support made victory easier and casualties lower. The irony that Müller noted in his personal journal, though never in any official report, was that the Americans were using technology to achieve what the Germans had always claimed was their own advantage: better coordination and faster reaction times. German propaganda had long maintained that German soldiers were superior man for man to their Allied counterparts, that German training and doctrine gave them a qualitative edge that could overcome quantitative disadvantages. The SCR-300 made a mockery of this claim. Yes, a German company commander might be more skilled, more experienced, better trained than his American counterpart. But that German commander was operating with information that was minutes to hours old, with support that took time to coordinate, with adjacent units that he couldn't contact directly. The American commander, who might be a citizen soldier with only months of training, had current information, immediate access to support, and constant coordination with adjacent units. The American didn't need to be better, he just needed to be competent, and the system would multiply his effectiveness. By the winter of 1944, as American forces pushed through France following the Normandy invasion, the communications disparity had become even more pronounced. The Wehrmacht was retreating, its communications infrastructure shattered, its radio stocks depleted through attrition and lack of replacement production. German companies were increasingly fighting isolated battles, cut off from higher headquarters, relying on whatever initiative their commanders could muster with the limited information available to them. The Americans, by contrast, were perfecting the art of coordinated combined arms warfare. Infantry companies with their SCR-300 radios worked seamlessly with tank battalions, artillery batteries and fighter-bomber squadrons. The entire system operated like a machine, with information flowing up and orders flowing down at speeds that would have seemed impossible just years earlier. A German lieutenant who survived the fighting in Normandy and was later captured near the German border in 1945 described the experience in interrogation. "We would identify an American position, plan our approach, move into position for the assault. Before we could attack, their artillery would already be firing on our assembly area. Before we could withdraw, their tanks would be moving to cut us off. It was as if they could read our minds. We later learned they couldn't read our minds, they were simply talking to each other while we were still sending runners." The SCR-300 that sat on Muller's desk in that Italian villa in 1943 was more than a captured piece of enemy equipment. It was a window into a future where military operations would be defined not by the brilliance of individual commanders but by the speed and reliability of communications networks. It was evidence that the age of Auftragstaktik, of mission-type tactics requiring independent initiative because communications would fail, was ending. The new age would belong to armies that could coordinate their actions in real time, that could mass their combat power at decisive points faster than enemies could react, that could operate as integrated systems rather than collections of independent units. The German army had pioneered modern combined arms warfare with the Blitzkrieg campaigns of 1939 and 1940. But the Americans were perfecting a version of warfare that the Germans couldn't match: coordination at the speed of radio waves. Muller's report concluded with a recommendation that must have seemed almost defeatist to his superiors. "We cannot match American production of tactical radios. We cannot replicate their frequency modulation technology at scale. We cannot train sufficient radio operators to create an equivalent communications network even if we had the equipment. Therefore, we must adapt our doctrine to account for an enemy who can coordinate faster than we can maneuver. This will require fundamental changes to how we plan and execute operations." The recommendation was never implemented. The Wehrmacht continued to fight with the doctrine and equipment it had, relying on the skill and initiative of its commanders to overcome growing material disadvantages. In some ways, this was the only choice available. Germany couldn't magic into existence the industrial capacity to produce 50,000 tactical radios. The German officer corps couldn't unlearn decades of tactical tradition overnight. But the consequence was that every German unit, from platoon to division, was fighting at an increasing disadvantage against an enemy who could out-coordinate them even when the Germans had local superiority in skill, experience, or numbers. The mathematics of this disadvantage were inexorable. In 1,000 small engagements across Italy, France, and eventually Germany itself, Wehrmacht units found themselves outmaneuvered by an enemy who could react faster, mass fires quicker, and adapt more rapidly to changing circumstances. The captured SCR-300 sat in storage for the remainder of the war, eventually lost in the chaos of Germany's collapse. Muller survived the war, returned to civilian life, and rarely spoke of his experiences. But years later, when asked what single factor had most surprised him about fighting the Americans, he always gave the same answer: they could talk to each other and we couldn't. Everything else followed from that. The winter of 1944 brought the war to German soil, and with it came a crystallization of everything that Hauptmann Muller had documented in his report from Sicily. The Battle of the Bulge, Germany's last major offensive in the West, would serve as both a testament to German tactical skill and a final demonstration of why that skill could no longer overcome American material advantages. On the morning of December 16, 1944, German forces achieved complete tactical surprise, smashing through American lines in the Ardennes forest with an offensive that seemed to herald a return to the Blitzkrieg victories of earlier years. 3 German armies, comprising some 250,000 men, drove westward through snow and fog, overrunning American positions, capturing thousands of prisoners and threatening to split the Allied armies in two. For the first 72 hours, the offensive rolled forward with the kind of speed and violence that had characterized German operations in Poland and France. American units, caught unprepared and scattered across a thinly held defensive line, fell back in confusion. The German plan called for rapid exploitation before American reserves could be brought to bear, before the Allies could coordinate their response, before their material superiority could be mobilized. But the German High Command had made a fatal miscalculation. They had planned for an American army that communicated like the Wehrmacht, slowly through runners and scheduled radio transmissions, with information flowing up the chain of command and orders flowing back down. What they encountered instead was an American force that could reorganize itself at speeds German planners had not thought possible. Within hours of the initial German breakthrough, American battalion commanders across the Ardennes were reporting the attacks through their SCR-300 radios. These reports flowed to regimental headquarters, then to division, then to corps, then to General Dwight Eisenhower's Supreme Headquarters, all through a communications network that functioned even as units were being overrun, even as headquarters were being hastily relocated, even as the situation descended into chaos. By the evening of December 16, less than 12 hours after the offensive began, Eisenhower had released his strategic reserves. The 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions, resting behind the lines, were already moving toward the breakthrough points. The Third Army under General George Patton received orders to disengage from operations in the Saar and redeploy north. Artillery battalions from across the front were being shifted to reinforce threatened sectors. The speed of this response would have been impossible without the communications infrastructure the Americans had built. Every unit in motion was in radio contact with higher headquarters. Every shift in the tactical situation was reported within minutes. Every change in German dispositions triggered an immediate American reaction. The Wehrmacht was fighting an enemy that could think and react faster than German forces could advance. At the tactical level, the SCR-300 proved its worth in countless small actions that collectively blunted the German offensive. At Bastogne, where the 101st Airborne Division found itself surrounded, radio communications allowed the defenders to coordinate their perimeter defense with devastating efficiency. American artillery forward observers, equipped with SCR-300 radios, could call and fire missions that broke up German attacks before they could develop momentum. When the weather cleared on December 23 and Allied fighter bombers could take to the air, the coordination between ground and air forces reached levels of effectiveness that the Germans simply could not match. American companies under attack would radio their battalion headquarters, which would relay requests through air liaison officers, who would vector fighter bombers onto German columns, all within minutes. The Germans called it Jabberjagged, the fighter bomber hunt, and it decimated their armored spearheads. A German tank commander, Oberleutnant Hans von Luck, later described the experience in his memoirs. We would advance through a forest, believing ourselves concealed from aerial observation. Within minutes of emerging into open ground, American fighter bombers would appear overhead. At first we thought they must have spies everywhere, that French civilians were betraying our movements. Only later did we understand, their ground troops were calling in our positions as they saw us. The radio in every American platoon was worth more than any number of spies. The offensive that had begun with such promise ground to a halt by early January 1945, having gained ground but failed to achieve any of its strategic objectives. The Americans had bent but not broken, had reorganized faster than the Germans could exploit their initial success, had coordinated their response with a speed and efficiency that German doctrine had no answer for. In the aftermath of the Bulge, German signals intelligence officers conducted their own analysis of captured American equipment and interrogation of American prisoners. What they found confirmed everything Mueller had reported 15 months earlier. The Americans had an SCR-300 radio at every company level, often multiple radios per company. They had SCR-536 handhelds in every platoon. They had tank radios, artillery radios, air liaison radios, all operating on compatible frequencies, all part of an integrated communications network. More troubling still, the Americans were now fielding improved versions of their radio equipment. Battery life had been extended. Weatherproofing had been enhanced. New models were lighter, more reliable, easier to operate. The trajectory was clear. American communications technology was getting better even as German capabilities were degrading through attrition and lack of replacement production. By February 1945, as Allied armies closed on the Rhine, the Wehrmacht was fighting with perhaps one-third of the radio equipment it had possessed at the start of the war. Replacement radios were unavailable. Trained radio operators had been killed or captured. Batteries were in short supply. The famous German tactical flexibility, the initiative of junior commanders, the vaunted Auftragstaktik, all of it was being ground down by the simple reality that German units could no longer communicate effectively with each other or with higher headquarters. American forces, by contrast, had more radios in 1945 than they had in 1944, more trained operators, better procedures, more sophisticated doctrine for employing their communications advantage. The asymmetry had widened to the point where it was no longer merely an advantage but a fundamental structural difference in how the two armies functioned. A Wehrmacht operations officer, captured during the Rhine crossing, told his interrogators, "You Americans fight with your radios. We fight with our soldiers. In 1940 our soldiers were better. In 1945 your radios are better. The result is inevitable." The final months of the war in Europe saw the complete collapse of German communications infrastructure. As the Reich shrank, as transportation networks were destroyed by Allied bombing, as fuel supplies dwindled, even the limited radio communication the Wehrmacht had maintained became increasingly sporadic. German commanders frequently found themselves operating in near total isolation, making decisions based on information that was hours or days old, unable to coordinate with adjacent units, unable to call for support that no longer existed. The Americans, pushing through Germany, encountered German units that surrendered not because they had been defeated in combat but because they had been cut off from communication and support, because they had no orders, because they no longer knew what they were fighting for or even where their own forces were. The decentralized initiative that Auftragstaktik had cultivated could only function within a framework of shared understanding and common purpose. When that framework dissolved, when communication broke down completely, initiative alone could not sustain organized resistance. The SCR-300, that 35-pound backpack radio that Hauptmann Müller had examined in Sicily, had played its small part in this collapse. Not through any single dramatic action, but through the cumulative effect of thousands of tactical engagements where American forces could coordinate faster, mass fires quicker, and adapt more readily than their German opponents. The post-war analysis conducted by both American and German military historians confirmed what battlefield commanders had already learned through bitter experience. Reliable tactical communications had become as important to modern warfare as firepower, mobility, or protection. An army that could coordinate its actions in real time held an overwhelming advantage over an enemy that could not, regardless of other factors like training, experience, or tactical skill. The lessons were not lost on military establishments around the world. The Soviet Red Army, having observed American communications capabilities during their cooperation in the final stages of the war, made tactical radio production a priority in their post-war modernization. The British Army, which had relied on their own wireless sets during the war, studied American communications doctrine and equipment extensively. Even the Israeli Defense Forces, formed in the aftermath of the war, incorporated American-style tactical communications as a fundamental element of their military structure. The SCR-300 itself had a long afterlife. After the war, surplus units were used by armies around the world. The radio saw service in Korea, where American forces once again benefited from superior tactical communications against an enemy, initially the North Korean People's Army, later Chinese forces, that had limited radio equipment. It remained in use in some armies into the 1950s, until transistor technology allowed for even smaller, lighter, more reliable tactical radios. But the SCR-300's true legacy was not the specific technology, which became obsolete within a decade of the war's end. Its legacy was the principle it embodied, that modern infantry forces required reliable, portable, easy-to-use communications at every level, from squad to division. This principle, proven in combat from Sicily to the Rhine, became foundational to all subsequent military communications development. The frequency modulation technology that Daniel Noble and Henryk Magnuski had pioneered for the SCR-300 became standard for tactical military radios. The concept of channelized operation, allowing multiple units to communicate simultaneously without interference, became universal. The idea that radio communications should be simple enough for any soldier to operate after minimal training became doctrine. In a broader sense, the SCR-300 marked the beginning of a transformation in how armies fought. The Second World War had begun with armies that communicated much as they had in the First World War, through telephone wires, runners, and carefully scheduled radio transmissions. It ended with armies that were beginning to function as networked systems, where information flowed in real time, where command and control operated at unprecedented speeds, where coordination happened continuously rather than episodically. The German army had entered the war as perhaps the most tactically sophisticated force in history, with a doctrine that maximized the initiative and skill of its commanders at every level. But tactical sophistication, individual initiative, and decentralized command could not overcome an enemy that could coordinate its actions faster than German forces could execute their maneuvers. The Americans didn't need to be more skilled, they just needed to be connected. Hauptmann Müller survived the war and returned to Germany, where he worked as an engineer in the rebuilding telecommunications industry. In the 1960s, when asked by a military historian about his wartime service, he spoke at length about the Sicily campaign and the captured SCR-300. He had kept a copy of his report from September 1943, and reading it decades later, he noted that every conclusion he had drawn had proven correct. "I wrote that we couldn't match American radio production, and we couldn't," he said. "I wrote that we couldn't overcome their communications advantage through superior training or tactics, and we couldn't. I wrote that they had created a command structure that combined decentralized initiative with centralized coordination, and they had. Everything followed from that one simple radio. They could talk to each other and we couldn't. That was the war, really. Everything else was just details." The SCR-300 radio, designed in 1942, deployed in 1943, proven in combat from Italy to Germany, represented more than American technological ingenuity or industrial capacity. It represented a fundamental reimagining of how modern infantry could fight. In the hands of citizen soldiers, many of whom had been civilians just months before, it provided capabilities that professional armies of earlier eras could not have imagined. For the Wehrmacht, trained in a doctrine of decentralized initiative, commanded by officers who had studied warfare as a lifelong profession, equipped with tactical skills honed through years of combat, the lesson was bitter. None of it mattered when the enemy could coordinate faster than you could act. The radio on Hauptmann Muller's desk in Palermo had been both a technical marvel and a harbinger of defeat, not because of what it was, but because of what it represented about the armies that would decide the war's outcome. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now and don't forget to subscribe.